In the darkest days of 1941, as German U-boats strangled Britain's Atlantic lifelines and the Kriegsmarine prowled the North Sea with impunity, a grease-stained mechanic from Liverpool's Docklands proposed an idea so audacious that Whitehall dismissed it as madness. Jack Torres, a 34-year-old aircraft fitter at RAF Coastal Command's Chivenor base in Devon, had watched too many Wellington bombers limp home, riddled with cannon fire, their crews dead or dying, unable to defend themselves against marauding Luftwaffe fighters protecting German naval convoys. His solution: transform these lumbering bombers into flying fortresses bristling with 14 guns, a concept that violated every principle of aircraft design the Air Ministry held sacred. What the bureaucrats in London didn't know was that Torres had already built a prototype in secret, cannibalizing parts from crashed aircraft in the dead of night, and the results of its first combat sortie would arrive on their desks within 72 hours. Written in the wreckage of 9 German vessels and the stunned testimony of a Kriegsmarine admiral who would tell his interrogators, "We thought the British had conjured demons from the sky." The North Sea had become Britain's graveyard by the winter of 1941, and every man stationed at RAF Chivenor knew it with the certainty of a death sentence. Jack Torres stood in the freezing pre-dawn darkness of the Devon airfield, watching another Wellington bomber crew climb aboard their aircraft for what the station commander euphemistically called a maritime reconnaissance patrol. Torres knew better. He'd scraped enough blood from cockpit floors and counted enough empty beds in the barracks to understand the brutal arithmetic. Of every 10 Wellington crews sent to hunt German naval convoys, fewer than 4 returned. Those who did come back brought aircraft so shot to pieces that Torres sometimes wondered if it wouldn't be kinder to simply push the wrecks into the sea rather than attempt repairs. The Vickers Wellington, affectionately called the Wimpy after the cartoon character, was a remarkable aircraft in many respects. Its geodetic airframe, designed by the brilliant Barnes Wallis, could absorb tremendous punishment and remain airborne. Torres had seen Wellingtons return with holes large enough to crawl through, their fabric skins shredded, yet still flying. But for all its structural resilience, the Wellington possessed a fatal flaw that was killing British aircrews at an appalling rate. It was desperately underarmed. Standard Coastal Command Wellingtons carried a pitiful defensive armament. A single .303 Browning machine gun in the nose turret, 2 more in the tail turret, and perhaps a beam gun firing through the fuselage windows if the crew was lucky. Against the heavily armed Messerschmitt Bf 110 fighters and Junkers Ju 88 heavy fighters that the Luftwaffe deployed to protect their naval convoys, this was tantamount to facing a firing squad with a pocket knife. The German fighters, bristling with 20mm cannons and 7.92mm machine guns, could stand off at ranges where the Wellington's 303s were useless and methodically tear the British bombers apart. Torres had arrived at Chivenor in September 1940, transferred from a maintenance unit in Manchester, where he'd spent the Blitz repairing damaged aircraft while German bombs fell around him. A Liverpudlian by birth, he'd grown up in the shadow of the docks, the son of a merchant seaman who drowned when his convoy was torpedoed in 1917. Jack had inherited his father's hatred of German militarism and his mother's stubborn refusal to accept defeat. He'd learned his trade in the aircraft factories of the North, where he'd developed a reputation for unorthodox solutions and an almost supernatural ability to keep damaged aircraft flying with whatever materials came to hand, a skill the British called making do and mending and elevated to a national virtue. But Chivenor had tested even Torres's resilience. The station was Coastal Command's forward base for anti-shipping operations, positioned on the North Devon coast where the Bristol Channel met the Atlantic. From here, Wellingtons flew grueling 8-hour patrols, searching for German naval convoys, supplying occupied Norway, hunting U-boats in the Bay of Biscay, and attempting to interdict the iron ore shipments from Sweden that fed the Nazi war machine. The work was vital. Churchill himself had declared the Battle of the Atlantic Britain's most critical campaign. But the cost was staggering. Torres kept a private ledger hidden in his bunk, where he recorded every aircraft lost and every man killed. The numbers haunted him. In the 3 months since his arrival, Chivanor had lost 23 Wellington bombers and 138 men. Some had been shot down by fighters. Others had been destroyed by the intense anti-aircraft fire that German naval vessels put up. The Kriegsmarine had learned to bristle their convoy escorts with 20mm and 37mm flak guns that created walls of exploding steel through which the Wellingtons had to fly to deliver their bombs and torpedoes. Still, others had simply disappeared, vanishing into the grey immensity of the North Sea, their fates unknown. The problem was brutally simple. The Wellington had been designed as a night bomber for attacks on land targets, where darkness provided protection and defensive armament was secondary. Pressed into daylight maritime service, it was a death trap. The aircraft was too slow to outrun fighters, too poorly armed to fight them off, and too vulnerable to the concentrated flak of naval convoys. Yet Coastal Command had no alternative. The Bristol Beaufighter, which would eventually excel in the anti-shipping role, was still in short supply and plagued by engine problems. The Wellington was what Britain had, and so the Wellington was what British aircrews died in, day after day, while Torres and his fellow ground crew patched the survivors back together and sent them out to die again. The breaking point came on a bitter February morning in 1941. Torres was in the maintenance hangar, working on a Wellington that had returned the previous evening with its hydraulic system shot away, when he heard the distinctive asynchronous drone of damaged Merlin engines. He dropped his tools and ran outside with a dozen other ground crew, all of them knowing that sound meant another crew was coming home in trouble. The Wellington appeared through the low cloud base, trailing smoke from both engines, its fabric skin flapping in strips, the entire tail section a lattice of holes. It was Wellington IC serial number R1034, piloted by Flight Lieutenant James Ashford, a 22-year-old from Surrey who'd been at Chivanor for 6 weeks. Torres had shared tea with Ashford's crew the previous evening, listening to the wireless broadcast of a variety show from London, all of them pretending they weren't terrified of the morning's mission. The Wellington made its approach too fast, the pilot fighting controls that clearly weren't responding properly. It hit the runway hard, bounced, hit again, and slewed sideways as the port undercarriage collapsed. The aircraft ground to a halt in a shower of sparks and tearing metal. The fire crew was already racing toward it, foam spraying, as Torres and the others ran to help extract the crew. 4 men emerged from the wreck. 2 were dead, the navigator and the wireless operator, both killed by cannon fire that had raked the fuselage. The rear gunner had been wounded, a 20mm shell fragment embedded in his shoulder, and was screaming in agony as the medics loaded him onto a stretcher. Ashford himself was uninjured physically, but in a state of shock, his hands trembling uncontrollably, his eyes vacant. Torres helped the pilot away from the aircraft as the station medical officer arrived. Ashford grabbed Torres's arm with surprising strength, his voice a harsh whisper. "We never had a chance, Jack. Never had a bloody chance. 3 Messerschmitts came at us from the sun. We got off maybe 20 rounds before they shot away the tail turret. 20 rounds. They just sat there 400 yards out and took us apart piece by piece, like we were a target on a practice range. We couldn't touch them, couldn't even make them flinch." The medical officer led Ashford away, and Torres stood in the cold wind, watching the fire crew foam down the wrecked Wellington. Around him, other ground crew were already assessing the damage, calculating whether the aircraft could be repaired or would be written off. Torres barely heard them. His mind was racing through a calculation of his own, one that had been building for months but had suddenly crystallized into absolute clarity. The Wellington's defensive armament was inadequate, not because British engineers were incompetent, but because they designed the aircraft for a different war, a war of night bombing where fighters were rare and darkness was the primary defense. But that war had changed. Coastal Command was fighting in daylight against an enemy that had adapted, that had learned to position fighter cover over their convoys and had armed their ships to the teeth. The doctrine hadn't changed, but the reality had, and British aircrews were paying for that gap with their lives. What if, Torres thought, the Wellington could be transformed? What if, instead of accepting its role as a lightly armed bomber that relied on speed and evasion, neither of which it actually possessed, it could be turned into something else entirely? A flying fortress that could fight its way through fighter screens and flak barrages, that could suppress the anti-aircraft fire from convoy escorts while delivering its bombs and torpedoes, that could give German fighter pilots a reason to think twice before pressing an attack. The idea was heretical. Every principle of aircraft design emphasized that weight was the enemy, that every pound added to an aircraft reduced its performance, its range, its bomb load. Adding more guns meant adding more weight. The guns themselves, the ammunition, the mountings, the gunners to operate them. It would make the Wellington slower, reduce its ceiling, cut its range. The Air Ministry would never approve it. Whitehall would call it madness. But Torres had spent months watching men die because they couldn't defend themselves. He'd scraped their blood from cockpit floors, packed their belongings to send home to grieving families, and listened to the survivors describe the helplessness of facing German fighters with inadequate weapons. He'd also spent those months studying the Wellington's geodetic structure, understanding its remarkable strength, calculating its load-bearing capacity, and he'd come to a conclusion that contradicted everything the textbook said. The Wellington could carry far more weight than anyone realized, if that weight was distributed properly across its unique airframe. Torres made his decision, standing there in the cold Devon wind, watching the wreckage of R2-1234 being towed away. He would build a prototype, not a proposal, not a drawing to submit through proper channels where it would be buried in bureaucracy and skepticism. An actual flying prototype, a Wellington transformed into a 14-gun monster that could prove the concept beyond any doubt. He would do it in secret, using his authority as senior maintenance NCO to requisition parts and materials, working at night when the station was quiet, enlisting a handful of trusted fellow mechanics who shared his rage at the senseless slaughter. It was, he knew, a court-martial offense. Modifying military aircraft without authorization, misappropriating military resources, violating a dozen regulations that existed for good reasons. If he was caught before he could prove the concept worked, his career would be over, and he'd likely spend the rest of the war in a military prison. But if he succeeded, if he could create a Wellington that could fight back, that could give British crews a fighting chance, then perhaps the court-martial would be worth it. That evening, Torres approached three men. Sergeant Bill Hutchins, a weapons specialist from Birmingham who'd been an armourer at a fighter station during the Battle of Britain. Corporal Tom Davies, a Welsh structural engineer who'd worked in the Bristol aircraft factory before the war, and leading aircraftman Peter Walsh, a young electrician from Dublin with a genius for improvising wiring systems. Torres laid out his plan in the corner of the NAFI canteen, speaking quietly, watching their faces for signs of doubt or fear. There was a long silence when he finished. Then Hutchins, who'd lost his brother, a Wellington pilot, over the North Sea in December, nodded slowly. "I'm in," he said simply. "Someone has to do something, and it might as well be us." Davies and Walsh agreed. They understood the risks, but they also understood that doing nothing meant watching more crews die. That night, the four men began planning the transformation of Wellington IC serial number T2987, an aircraft that had been damaged in a landing accident and officially listed as under extended repair, which meant it was off the active roster and unlikely to be closely monitored. Torres's design was audacious in its scope. He proposed adding gun positions at every point where the Wellington structure could support them. A 4-gun power turret in the nose, replacing the single-gun manual turret. Twin beam guns on each side of the fuselage, firing through enlarged windows. a ventral turret beneath the fuselage, covering the vulnerable belly, and an upgraded tail turret with 4 guns instead of 2. In total, 14. 303 Browning machine guns, all capable of being brought to bear on attacking fighters or surface targets. The challenges were immense. The power turrets would require hydraulic systems that didn't exist on standard Wellingtons. The additional ammunition, Torres calculated they'd need at least 10,000 rounds to make the armament effective, would add over 800 pounds of weight. The structural modifications to mount the turrets and reinforce the fuselage would require precision engineering. And all of it would have to be done in secret at night, using tools and materials scrounged from across the station. But Torres had advantages that made the impossible merely extraordinarily difficult. First, the Wellington's geodetic structure, a basket-weave framework of aluminum alloy covered with fabric, was far stronger than conventional aircraft construction. Barnes-Wallis had designed it to distribute loads across the entire airframe, which meant that adding weight at multiple points wouldn't overstress any single structural member. Second, Chivanor was a busy operational station with multiple aircraft under repair at any given time, which meant that requisitioning parts and materials wouldn't immediately raise suspicions. Third, Torres had cultivated relationships with supply sergeants and depot managers across Coastal Command, men who owed him favors and wouldn't ask too many questions about unusual requisitions. The work began in earnest in mid-February 1941. Torres and his team worked from midnight to 4 in the morning, when the station was quietest and the maintenance hangar was officially closed. They started with the nose turret, removing the standard single-gun mounting and installing a 4-gun Fraser-Nash power turret cannibalized from a crashed Blenheim bomber. The hydraulic system required running new lines through the fuselage, a painstaking task that Davies handled with the precision of a surgeon. Walsh rewired the electrical systems to power the turret motors and the gun-firing circuits, creating a distribution panel that could handle the increased load. The beam guns were simpler in concept, but challenging in execution. Torres designed simple pintle mounts that could be bolted to reinforced frames in the fuselage, allowing gunners to traverse the weapons through enlarged windows. The trick was positioning them so they provided overlapping fields of fire without creating blind spots. After numerous calculations and mock-ups, they settled on 4 positions, 2 on each side, staggered along the fuselage, that gave nearly 360-degree coverage when combined with the nose and tail turrets. The ventral turret was the most controversial element of the design. Conventional wisdom held that belly turrets were impractical on bombers because they interfered with bomb loads and created aerodynamic drag. But Torres had studied combat reports and knew that German fighters often attacked from below, where most bombers had minimal defensive fire. He designed a retractable turret that could be lowered into the slipstream for combat and raised flush with the fuselage for bombing runs and landing. The mechanism was crude, a hand-crank system that required muscle power, but it worked. By early March, after 3 weeks of clandestine work, the transformation was nearly complete. T-2987 no longer resembled a standard Wellington. It bristled with gun barrels at every angle, a porcupine of defensive firepower that looked, as Hutchins remarked, like something out of a fever dream. The aircraft was heavier. Torres's calculations showed they'd added nearly 200 pounds, but ground tests of the control surfaces showed it was still flyable. The real test would come in the air. The problem was finding a pilot willing to test fly an unauthorized modification without asking too many questions. Torres needed someone skilled enough to handle an aircraft with altered flight characteristics, brave enough to take the risk, and discreet enough to keep quiet if the test failed. He found his man in Flight Lieutenant Robert "Robbie" McLeod, a Scottish pilot who'd been grounded after a crash landing had left him with a limp that failed the medical board standards for operational flying. McLeod was bitter about his grounding, desperate to get back in the air, and had a well-earned reputation for bending regulations when it suited him. Torres approached McLeod in the officer's mess one evening, speaking carefully, feeling out the pilot's attitude. When he finally explained what he'd done, McLeod's reaction was not what Torres expected. The Scotsman laughed, a genuine, delighted laugh, and said, "You magnificent bastard. You've actually built it. I've been arguing for something like this for months, and those idiots at the Air Ministry kept telling me it was impossible. When do we fly?" The test flight was scheduled for dawn on March 15, 1941, when the station would be busy with operational launches and one more Wellington taking off wouldn't attract attention. Torres and his team spent the night before doing final checks, loading ammunition, and praying that their calculations were correct. If the aircraft was too heavy, if the center of gravity was wrong, if the structural modifications had weakened the airframe, McLeod could die, and their entire effort would end in catastrophe and court-martial. McLeod arrived at the hangar at 05:30, walking with his characteristic limp, carrying his flying gear. He circled T-2987 slowly, examining the modifications, occasionally reaching out to test a gun mounting or peer into a turret. Finally, he turned to Torres and said, "She's beautiful, Jack, absolutely beautiful. If this works, you'll have saved more lives than you can count. And if it doesn't work, well, at least we tried something instead of just watching men die." At 600, as the first light of dawn broke over the Devon coast, McLeod fired up T-2987's Bristol Pegasus engines. The aircraft taxied to the runway, and Torres stood with his team watching, his heart pounding, as the Wellington began its takeoff roll. The aircraft was sluggish, taking longer than normal to unstick, but it lifted off smoothly and climbed into the grey morning sky. For the next hour, McLeod put T-2987 through its paces, climbs, turns, dives, stalls, testing how the additional weight affected handling. Torres listened to the radio transmissions, hearing the pilot's running commentary. "She's heavier, definitely heavier. Climb rate is down about 15%, but she's stable, controls are responsive. The turrets don't seem to affect the aerodynamics much. I'm going to try some combat maneuvers." What happened next would become legend at Chivanor. McLeod spotted a German Dornier Do-17 reconnaissance aircraft, a lone intruder that had strayed too close to the British coast, and decided to engage. The Dornier's crew, seeing a Wellington, assumed they were safe. Wellingtons were bombers, not fighters, and easily evaded. They were wrong. McLeod closed to 400 yards and opened fire with all 14 guns. The effect was devastating. The combined firepower of 14 303 Brownings, roughly 200 rounds per second, created a cone of bullets that no aircraft could survive. The Dornier staggered as cannon shells, no machine gun bullets, but so many of them that the effect was similar, tore through its wings and fuselage. Within seconds, the German aircraft was trailing smoke. Within 30 seconds, it was falling toward the sea, its crew bailing out. McLeod's voice came over the radio, excited and incredulous. "Control, this is Wellington T-2987. I've just shot down a Dornier. Repeat, I've shot down a Dornier. This bloody thing works. It actually works." Torres felt his knees go weak with relief. It worked. The impossible modification, the court-martial-worthy gamble, the 3 weeks of secret midnight labor, it all worked. T-2987 landed 20 minutes later, and McLeod climbed out grinning like a madman, grabbing Torres in a bear hug and shouting, "We've done it, Jack! We've bloody well done it!" But their celebration was short-lived. The station commander, Group Captain Harold Winters, was waiting at the hangar, his face like thunder. He'd been informed of the unauthorized test flight and the engagement with the Dornier, and he was not pleased. "Sergeant Torres," he said coldly, "my office, now, and bring whoever else was involved in this modification." Torres and his team stood at attention in Winters's office, expecting the worst. The group captain paced behind his desk, his anger palpable. "Do you have any idea," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "how many regulations you've violated? Unauthorized modification of military aircraft, misappropriation of military resources, conducting test flights without approval. engaging enemy aircraft in an experimental aircraft. I could have you all court-martialed and imprisoned." There was a long silence. Then Torres, knowing his career was likely over anyway, spoke up. "With respect, sir, I know exactly how many regulations we violated. I also know how many men we've lost in the last 3 months because our aircraft can't defend themselves. 138 men, sir. I counted every one. If there's a chance, even a small chance, that this modification could save some of those lives, then I'd violate every regulation in the book and consider it time well spent." Winters stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, the group captain's face softened slightly. "Flight Lieutenant McLeod tells me your modification is effective. He says the aircraft handles well despite the additional weight, and that the firepower is, his word was, devastating. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir," Torres replied. "We've increased defensive armament by 250% while maintaining acceptable flight characteristics. The aircraft is slower and has reduced range, but it can fight back against fighters and suppress flak from surface vessels. It gives the crew a fighting chance." Winters was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not going to court-martial you, Sergeant Torres. Not yet, anyway. Instead, I'm going to do something that will probably get me court-martialed. I'm going to authorize a combat trial of your modification, one operational mission against a German convoy. If it succeeds, I'll forward your design to Coastal Command Headquarters with my strongest recommendation. If it fails, we'll all face the consequences together." Dismissed. Torres and his team left the office in a daze. They'd expected punishment and received instead a chance to prove their concept in combat. It was more than they'd dared hope for, but it also meant that everything now depended on a single mission. If T-2987 failed, if the modification proved ineffective in actual combat, then all their work would be for nothing, and their careers would be over. The mission was scheduled for March 20th, 1941. Intelligence had identified a German convoy moving south along the Norwegian coast. 6 merchant vessels carrying iron ore from Narvik to Germany, escorted by 2 destroyers and covered by Messerschmitt Bf 110 fighters from a base in Stavanger. It was exactly the kind of target that had been costing Coastal Command so dearly. Heavily defended, with both naval flak and fighter cover, requiring the attacking bombers to run a gauntlet of fire to deliver their weapons. McLeod would pilot T-2987 with a volunteer crew who'd been briefed on the aircraft's modifications and understood the risks. Torres and his team spent the days before the mission checking and rechecking every system, loading ammunition, and making final adjustments. The tension at Chivanor was palpable. Word had spread about the modified Wellington, and everyone on the station knew that something unprecedented was about to happen. On the morning of March 20th, Torres watched T-2987 take off into a grey dawn, accompanied by 3 standard Wellingtons as part of a coordinated strike. He'd done everything he could. Now it was up to McLeod and his crew, and to the 14 guns that Torres had spent 3 weeks installing. The wait for their return would be the longest 4 hours of Jack Torres's life, and the outcome would determine not just his fate, but potentially the fate of every Coastal Command crew flying against German naval targets. As T-2987 disappeared into the clouds, Torres whispered a prayer he'd learned from his mother, a prayer for sailors at sea. It seemed appropriate for airmen flying over the ocean, hunting an enemy that had already killed so many. "Bring them home," he whispered. "Just bring them home." The North Sea was a grey wilderness beneath T-2987 as Flight Lieutenant Robbie McLeod held the Wellington at 8,000 feet, flying in loose formation with 3 standard Wellingtons from 221 Squadron. The modified aircraft handled differently than McLeod was accustomed to, heavier on the controls, slightly more sluggish in the turns, but after an hour of flight, he'd adapted to its characteristics. What impressed him most was the sense of confidence the additional armament provided. For the first time in his operational career, McLeod didn't feel like he was flying a defenseless target. He felt like he was flying a weapon. In the nose turret, Sergeant Arthur Kemp, a gunner from Manchester who'd volunteered for the mission after losing his best friend to a Messerschmitt attack, familiarized himself with the four-gun mounting. The firepower was intoxicating. Instead of the single 303 Browning he was accustomed to, he now controlled 4 guns with a combined rate of fire of nearly 5,000 rounds per minute. The hydraulic traverse was smooth, the gun sight clear. If German fighters came at them head-on, Kemp thought grimly, they were in for a very unpleasant surprise. Along the fuselage, 2 additional gunners, Corporals James Fletcher and David Morrison, manned the beam guns, one on each side of the aircraft. These were simpler mountings, manually aimed through enlarged windows, but they covered the vulnerable flanks where German fighters often attacked. In the ventral turret, leading aircraftman Thomas Wright crouched in the cramped space, his twin guns pointing downward, ready to engage fighters attacking from below. And in the tail turret, Sergeant William Bill Thornton, a veteran gunner with 6 confirmed kills, commanded 4 guns instead of the usual 2, giving him firepower that matched a fighter aircraft. The navigator, Flying Officer Charles Bennett, called out a course correction. They were approaching the Norwegian coast, where intelligence reported the German convoy was moving south through the inner leads, the protected channel between the mainland and the offshore islands. The weather was typical for March in the North Sea: low clouds, occasional rain squalls, visibility varying between 2 and 5 miles. It was weather that favored the defenders, making it difficult for the attackers to coordinate their approach, and easy for fighters to hide in the clouds. McLeod's radio crackled with the voice of squadron leader Thompson leading the formation in one of the standard Wellingtons. All aircraft, this is leader. Target should be visible in 5 minutes. We'll approach from the east, using the clouds for cover. Standard attack pattern. Leader and 2 will go for the merchants. 3 and 4 will suppress the escorts. Remember, the destroyers will put up heavy flak. Get in fast, drop your loads and get out. Good luck, chaps. McLeod keyed his microphone. 4 acknowledges. We'll take the northern destroyer. He'd deliberately chosen the most dangerous target, one of the escort vessels, because if T-2987's modifications were going to prove their worth, it would be in suppressing the intense anti-aircraft fire that made attacking naval convoys so deadly. The convoy appeared through a break in the clouds, 6 merchant vessels in 2 columns, with a destroyer on each flank. Even from 5 miles away, McLeod could see the wakes of the ships, white scars on the grey sea. And above the convoy, circling like sharks, were the dark silhouettes of German fighters. He counted 4 Messerschmitt Bf-110s, their twin engines and distinctive twin-tail configuration, unmistakable. "Fighters at 2 o'clock high," Kemp called from the nose turret. 4 of them, Bf-110s. "I see them," McLeod replied calmly. "Everyone stay sharp. They'll come at us as soon as we start our attack run." The formation began its descent, dropping from 8,000 feet to 2,000 feet as they approached the convoy. The German fighters reacted immediately, diving to intercept. McLeod watched them come, calculating angles and distances. In a standard Wellington, this would be the moment of maximum vulnerability. The fighters would close to 400 yards, beyond the effective range of the Wellington's 303s, and methodically shoot the bomber to pieces. But T-2987 wasn't a standard Wellington. The lead Bf-110 came in from the starboard quarter, exactly as McLeod expected. The German pilot was confident, having done this many times before, knowing that a Wellington's defensive fire was negligible at this range. He opened fire at 500 yards, his 20 mm cannons and machine guns creating a stream of tracers that reached toward the British bomber. McLeod didn't flinch. He held his course steady, giving his gunners a stable platform. "Starboard beam! Engage at will!" he ordered calmly. Corporal Fletcher, manning the starboard beam gun, had been tracking the Bf-110 since it began its attack run. He waited until the German fighter reached 400 yards, the maximum effective range of the 303 Browning, and then pressed his triggers. The gun roared, spitting a stream of bullets toward the Messerschmitt. At the same moment, Thornton in the tail turret opened fire with his 4 guns, adding his firepower to Fletcher's. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Bf-110 pilot, expecting minimal return fire, suddenly found himself flying through a storm of bullets. Tracers converged on his aircraft from 2 directions, the beam gun and the tail turret, creating a crossfire that was impossible to evade. The Messerschmitt staggered as bullets punched through its wings and fuselage. The pilot broke off his attack, diving away, trailing smoke from his port engine. "Hit! Hit!" Fletcher shouted. "He's smoking!" But there was no time to celebrate. The other 3 Bf-110s were attacking now, coming in from different angles, trying to overwhelm the Wellingtons' defenses. One came from directly ahead, a head-on attack that would have been devastating against a standard Wellington with its single nose gun. Kemp in the nose turret met it with 4 guns. The combined firepower was staggering, nearly 80 rounds per second converging on the attacking fighter. The Bf-110 pilot, suddenly facing firepower he hadn't expected, flinched and pulled up, his burst of cannon fire passing harmlessly beneath T-2987. A third Bf-110 attacked from below, the classic vulnerable approach for a bomber. But Wright, in the ventral turret, was waiting. He opened fire at 300 yards, his twin guns stitching a line of bullets across the Messerschmitt's nose. The German pilot, shocked to encounter defensive fire from a position where Wellingtons normally had none, broke off his attack and dove away. The 4th Bf-110 made a beam attack from the port side, and Morrison engaged with his beam gun, while Thornton swung his tail turret around to add his fire. The crossfire was too much. The Messerschmitt took hits in the wing and fuselage, and the pilot, seeing 2 of his comrades damaged and the 3rd driven off, decided that discretion was the better part of valor. The German fighters withdrew, climbing back to altitude, clearly reassessing their tactics. MacLeod allowed himself a tight smile. The modification worked. In less than 2 minutes of combat, T-2987 had driven off 4 German fighters without taking a single hit. The concentrated firepower from multiple angles had given the German pilots something they hadn't expected: a bomber that could fight back effectively, that could make attacking it a costly proposition. But the real test was still ahead. The convoy's escort destroyers had opened fire, their anti-aircraft guns filling the sky with exploding shells. Black puffs of flak appeared around the formation, and MacLeod felt T-2987 shudder as shrapnel rattled against the fuselage. This was the gauntlet that had killed so many coastal command crews. The concentrated flak from German naval vessels, firing 20mm, 37mm, and even 88mm guns in a defensive barrage that created a wall of steel through which the bombers had to fly. "Beginning attack run," MacLeod announced, pushing the control column forward and diving toward the northern destroyer. The German vessel was a Type 1934A destroyer, bristling with anti-aircraft guns, 4 37mm guns, 6 20mm guns, all firing as fast as their crews could load them. The sky around T-2987 became a nightmare of exploding shells and tracers. This was where Torres's modification would face its ultimate test. MacLeod had a theory, one he'd discussed with Torres during the planning. If T-2987 could bring its guns to bear on the destroyer's anti-aircraft positions, it might be able to suppress the flak long enough to make an accurate bombing run. It was a radical concept, using a bomber's defensive armament offensively, but the firepower was there. "All gunners," MacLeod ordered, his voice steady despite the flak bursting around them. "Target the destroyer's superstructure. Suppress those flak guns. Not needed 2,500 feet and closing. Every gun on T-2987 that could bear on the destroyer opened fire. Kemp in the nose turret, Fletcher and Morrison on the beam guns, Wright in the ventral turret, all of them poured fire into the German vessel. 14 303 Browning machine guns, firing nearly 200 rounds per second combined, created a devastating hail of bullets that swept across the destroyer's deck. The effect was immediate and profound. German sailors manning the exposed 20mm and 37mm guns were forced to take cover as bullets ricocheted off steel plating and tore through equipment. The volume of fire was so intense that the destroyer's anti-aircraft fire visibly slackened, not stopped entirely, but reduced enough to make a critical difference. Gun crews couldn't aim effectively while being shot at, couldn't maintain their rate of fire while diving for cover. MacLeod held T-2987 steady through the flak, feeling the aircraft shudder as shrapnel hit the wings and fuselage, trusting in the Wellington's legendary geodetic structure to absorb the punishment. At 800 feet, the bomb aimer called, "Bombs away!" and 4 250-pound bombs dropped from the Wellington's belly, falling toward the destroyer in a tight pattern. MacLeod pulled up hard, climbing away from the convoy as the bombs hit. 3 missed, exploding in the water alongside the destroyer, but the 4th struck the vessel amidships, penetrating the deck before exploding. The destroyer staggered, smoke and steam erupting from the hit, its speed visibly dropping. "Hit! We've hit her!" the bomb aimer shouted. But the mission wasn't over. The other 3 Wellingtons were making their attacks now, and the German fighters were regrouping for another pass. MacLeod circled at 3,000 feet, watching as Squadron Leader Thompson's aircraft dove on one of the merchant vessels. The standard Wellington was taking heavy flak, and MacLeod could see fabric tearing from its wings. Thompson's bombs hit the merchant ship, and the vessel erupted in flames. It had been carrying ammunition or fuel, and the explosion was spectacular. The second standard Wellington, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Davies, attacked another merchant ship, but was caught by concentrated flak. MacLeod watched in horror as the Wellington's port engine exploded, the aircraft rolling over and diving into the sea. There were no parachutes. Davies and his crew were gone in seconds, another entry in the grim ledger of coastal command losses. The third standard Wellington, flown by Pilot Officer Harris, successfully bombed a merchant vessel and was climbing away when the Bf-110s attacked again. This time the German fighters had learned from their encounter with T-2987. They attacked Harris's aircraft from multiple angles simultaneously, overwhelming its limited defensive fire. The Wellington staggered under the onslaught, its tail turret shot away, fabric streaming from its wings. Harris managed to keep the aircraft flying, diving into a cloud bank to escape, but it was clearly badly damaged. MacLeod made a decision. "We're going back in," he announced. "That destroyer is still operational, and Harris needs cover to get away." "Skipper, we've used half our ammunition," Thornton called from the tail turret. "Then we'll make the other half count," MacLeod replied grimly. He pushed the control column forward, diving T-2987 back toward the convoy. The German fighters saw him coming and moved to intercept, but this time they were more cautious, having learned that T-2987 was not a standard Wellington. The lead Bf-110, a different aircraft from the one that had attacked earlier, made a careful approach from the starboard quarter, staying at maximum range, probing for weaknesses. Thornton engaged with his tail turret, and Fletcher added fire from the beam gun. The Bf-110 pilot, facing the same concentrated crossfire that had damaged his comrades, broke off without pressing his attack. The German fighters circled warily, like wolves around a bear, looking for an opening, but unwilling to close to effective range. MacLeod used the respite to make another pass at the damaged destroyer. The German vessel was listing now, its speed reduced to barely 10 knots, smoke pouring from the amidships hit. But its anti-aircraft guns were still firing, and MacLeod could see crew members working frantically to control the damage. "One more suppression run," MacLeod ordered. "Let's finish this." T-2987 dove toward the destroyer again, and once more every gun that could bear opened fire. The hail of bullets swept across the German vessel's superstructure, forcing the flak crews to take cover. This time, MacLeod didn't drop bombs. They'd expended their load on the first attack, but the suppressive fire alone was devastating. With the destroyers' anti-aircraft fire reduced, the surviving merchant vessels were more vulnerable, and MacLeod could see crew members on the German ships abandoning their anti-aircraft positions and running for cover. The Bf-110s made one more attempt to attack T-2987, but Kemp in the nose turret and Thornton in the tail turret drove them off with concentrated fire. The German pilots, having lost one aircraft damaged and facing a bomber that fought back like a fighter, decided they'd had enough. They withdrew to altitude and circled at a distance, content to shadow the British bombers but unwilling to press further attacks. MacLeod turned T-2987 toward home, climbing to 5,000 feet and setting course for Chivanor. Behind them, the German convoy was in chaos. One merchant vessel was sinking, another was on fire, and the destroyer was dead in the water, listing heavily and clearly doomed. Squadron leader Thompson's Wellington had escaped, and Harris's damaged aircraft was limping toward England, losing altitude but still flying. The flight home took 2 hours, and MacLeod used the time to assess T-2987's condition. The aircraft had taken flak damage. There were holes in the wings and fuselage, and one of the beam guns had been damaged by shrapnel. But the geodetic structure had held. The engines were running smoothly, the controls were responsive, and all the gun turrets were still operational. It was a testament to both Barnes-Wallace's brilliant design and Torres's careful modifications. As they crossed the English coast, MacLeod keyed his radio. "Chivanor Control, this is Wellington T-2987. Mission successful, returning to base. We've got some stories to tell." T-2987 landed at Chivanor at 14:30 hours, and Torres was waiting on the hardstand with his team. MacLeod climbed out of the aircraft grinning, and the first thing he said was, "Jack, you beautiful bastard, it works. It bloody well works. We drove off 4 fighters, suppressed a destroyer's flak, and came home with minimal damage. Your modification just saved our lives." Torres and his team swarmed over T-2987, assessing the damage, counting the holes, checking the systems. The aircraft had taken punishment, but it had survived and completed its mission. More importantly, it had proven the concept beyond any doubt. A heavily armed Wellington could fight its way through fighter screens and flak barrages, could suppress enemy defenses, and could give its crew a fighting chance against overwhelming odds. Group Captain Winters arrived at the hard stand, accompanied by several other senior officers who'd heard about the mission. Winters circled T-2987 slowly, examining the modifications, listening as MacLeod described the combat in detail. When MacLeod finished, Winters turned to Torres and said, "Sergeant, I owe you an apology. When I first saw what you'd done, I thought you were mad. Now I think you might be a genius. I'm forwarding your design to Coastal Command headquarters immediately, with a recommendation for immediate implementation across the entire Wellington fleet." Torres felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost painful. They'd done it. The gamble had paid off. The court-martial he'd feared had become a commendation, but more importantly, the modification would be implemented, which meant other crews would have the same fighting chance that MacLeod's crew had today. But even as Torres savored the moment, he knew the real work was just beginning. Proving the concept in one combat mission was one thing, convincing the Air Ministry to adopt it across the entire fleet, overcoming the institutional resistance to such a radical modification, and actually implementing it on hundreds of aircraft. That would be a different kind of battle, one fought in conference rooms and offices rather than over the North Sea. And there was another concern, one that MacLeod voiced as they walked back to the debriefing room. "The Germans will adapt, Jack. They always do. Today we surprised them, and that gave us an advantage. But once they realize what we've done, they'll change their tactics. They'll attack from longer range, use heavier weapons, coordinate their attacks better. We've bought ourselves some time, but this isn't a permanent solution." Torres nodded. MacLeod was right. The modification was a significant improvement, but it wasn't a miracle. The fundamental problem remained. The Wellington was still a bomber pressed into a role it wasn't designed for, and no amount of additional guns could completely overcome that. But if the modification could save even a fraction of the crews being lost, if it could buy time until better aircraft became available, then it would be worth every hour of midnight labor and every regulation violated. That evening, as Torres sat in the NAFI canteen with a cup of tea, the British solution to every crisis, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. They'd done something that the textbook said was impossible, that Whitehall had dismissed as madness. They'd taken a desperate situation and found a solution through ingenuity, determination, and a willingness to break the rules when the rules were getting men killed. It was, Torres thought, a very British way of solving a problem. Not elegant, not by the book, but practical and effective. Make do and mend, improvise and adapt, keep calm and carry on. His mother would have been proud. But there was no time to rest. Word of T-2987's success had spread across Chivanor, and already other crews were asking when their aircraft would receive the modification. Torres and his team would be working around the clock for the foreseeable future, converting Wellingtons into the 14-gun monsters that could fight back. It would be exhausting, demanding work, but Torres welcomed it. Every aircraft they converted was another crew that might come home alive. As he finished his tea and headed back to the hangar, Torres passed the operations board where the day's losses were posted. Davies and his crew, 5 names added to the grim total. But Harris had made it home, his damaged Wellington landing safely despite its wounds. And MacLeod's crew had not only survived but had inflicted significant damage on the enemy. The mathematics of survival had shifted, if only slightly, and in the brutal calculus of war, Torres thought, even a slight shift could mean the difference between defeat and victory, between despair and hope. They'd proven that today. Now they had to prove it again and again, until the modification became standard and every coastal command Wellington had the firepower to fight back. The work continued into the night, as it would for many nights to come. But for the first time since arriving at Chivanor, Jack Torres felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. In a concrete bunker on the Norwegian coast near Stavanger, Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich of the Luftwaffe's 76th Destroyer Wing sat at a metal desk, staring at the combat report in front of him with an expression that alternated between disbelief and anger. Dietrich was a veteran fighter pilot with 23 confirmed kills, including 11 British bombers, and he prided himself on his analytical approach to aerial combat. He understood the capabilities and limitations of every aircraft the RAF flew, had studied their tactics, and had trained his pilots to exploit their weaknesses. But the report before him described something that shouldn't exist. A Wellington bomber that had fought off 4 Bf-110s and survived concentrated flak from a destroyer, all while inflicting significant damage on a German convoy. "It's impossible," Dietrich muttered, reading the report for the 3rd time. "Wellingtons don't fight like this." Oberleutnant Hans Weber, one of the pilots who'd engaged the mysterious Wellington, stood at attention across the desk. His left arm was bandaged. Shrapnel from his damaged aircraft's engine had wounded him during the emergency landing, and his face was pale. "With respect, Herr Hauptmann, I know what I saw. That Wellington had guns everywhere, nose, tail, sides, even underneath. When we attacked, it was like flying into a wall of bullets. I've engaged dozens of Wellingtons, and I've never seen anything like it." Dietrich leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through possibilities. The British were desperate, that much was clear. Coastal Command was losing aircraft at an unsustainable rate. German intelligence estimated that nearly 40% of Wellington bombers sent against naval convoys never returned. But desperation didn't explain how the British had managed to create a Wellington with firepower that rivaled a heavy fighter. The weight alone should have made the aircraft unflyable, or at least so slow and sluggish that it would be easy prey for Bf-110s. "Describe the engagement again," Dietrich ordered. "Every detail." Weber recounted the combat, his voice steady despite the obvious trauma of the experience. He described how the Wellington had maintained formation with 3 standard aircraft, how it had initially appeared no different from any other Wellington. The German fighters had attacked using their standard tactics, closing to 400 yards, beyond the effective range of the Wellingtons. 303 machine guns, and using their superior firepower to methodically destroy the bomber. But when I opened fire, Weber continued, the Wellington didn't try to evade, it held steady, and then it returned fire from multiple positions simultaneously. I was taking hits from the tail turret and from a beam gun, creating a crossfire I couldn't avoid. The volume of fire was, Herr Hauptmann, it was like attacking a destroyer, not a bomber. I had to break off or be shot down. Dietrich made notes, his analytical mind working through the implications. A Wellington that didn't evade, but instead fought back aggressively. Multiple gun positions creating overlapping fields of fire. Sufficient firepower to force experienced fighter pilots to break off their attacks. It represented a fundamental shift in British tactics, one that contradicted everything German doctrine assumed about bomber defensive capabilities. What about the other Wellingtons in the formation? Dietrich asked. Did they exhibit the same characteristics? No, Herr Hauptmann, Weber replied. We engaged 2 of them using standard tactics. One we shot down, the other we damaged severely. They had normal defensive armament, weak, easily overwhelmed. Only the one Wellington was different. That was interesting, Dietrich thought. If only one aircraft had the enhanced armament, it suggested this was an experimental modification, not yet implemented across the British fleet. That meant the Germans had a window of opportunity to develop counter-tactics before the modification became widespread. But it also meant the British had proven the concept worked, which meant they would almost certainly implement it as quickly as possible. Dietrich dismissed Weber and summoned his intelligence officer, Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer, a former engineering student from Munich who specialized in analyzing British aircraft capabilities. Bauer arrived carrying a folder of reconnaissance photographs and technical assessments. I've heard the reports about the modified Wellington, Bauer said before Dietrich could speak. I've been analyzing what we know. If the British have added the firepower that Weber describes, they must have solved several significant engineering problems. Explain, Dietrich ordered. Bauer spread photographs of standard Wellingtons across the desk. The Wellington uses a geodetic airframe, a basket-weave structure designed by Barnes-Wallis. It's remarkably strong for its weight, which is why Wellingtons can absorb tremendous damage and remain airborne. But it's also a structure optimized for a specific weight distribution. Adding multiple gun turrets and the associated ammunition would add at least 1,000 pounds, possibly more. That should degrade performance significantly, reduce speed, lower ceiling, shorter range. And yet this Wellington kept pace with standard aircraft and maneuvered effectively in combat, Dietrich said. Exactly, Bauer replied. Which suggests the British have found a way to distribute the additional weight across the geodetic structure without overstressing any single point. It's actually quite clever. The geodetic design is ideal for this kind of modification, if you understand the load paths and reinforce the critical points. Dietrich felt a grudging respect for whoever had designed this modification. It took genuine engineering skill to add so much weight to an aircraft without crippling its performance. But respect didn't change the tactical problem. If the British implemented this modification across their Wellington fleet, German fighter pilots would face a much more dangerous opponent. What are our options? Dietrich asked. Bauer considered the question carefully. We could attack from longer range, using our 20mm cannons at maximum distance. The Wellington's 303 machine guns have an effective range of about 400 yards, while our MGFF cannons are effective to 600 yards. If we stay beyond 400 yards, we can engage without facing return fire. That reduces our accuracy, Dietrich objected. At 600 yards, we'll expend far more ammunition for each kill, and our pilots will need to make multiple attack passes. That increases their exposure to the Wellington's guns and to other escorts. True, Bauer acknowledged. Alternatively, we could use heavier weapons. The Bf-110 can be equipped with 30mm Mk-108 cannons, which have much greater destructive power. A few hits from a 30mm cannon would destroy a Wellington, regardless of its defensive armament. The Mk-108 has limited ammunition and poor ballistics, Dietrich countered. It's effective only at close range, which puts us back in the Wellington's defensive envelope. They were both silent for a moment, recognizing the problem. The British modification had created a tactical dilemma. Attacking from long range reduced accuracy and effectiveness, while attacking from close range exposed the fighters to devastating defensive fire. It was a classic military problem. The British had found a way to make attacking their bombers costly enough that German pilots would hesitate, and that hesitation could mean the difference between a successful convoy defense and a disaster. Dietrich made a decision. I'm recommending to Fliegerkorps X that we change our tactics immediately. Until we develop effective countermeasures, our fighters will engage modified Wellingtons only when we have significant numerical superiority, at least 3 fighters per bomber. We'll attack in coordinated waves from multiple angles simultaneously, overwhelming their defensive fire through sheer numbers. And we'll prioritize attacks on standard Wellingtons, which remain vulnerable to our current tactics. It was an admission of defeat, in a sense. The Germans were acknowledging that a single modified Wellington was dangerous enough to require special tactics and numerical superiority. But Dietrich was a pragmatist. Better to adapt tactics and preserve his pilots than to continue using methods that were proving costly. Over the following weeks, reports of modified Wellingtons increased. German naval commanders reported that British bombers were suppressing their anti-aircraft fire with unprecedented effectiveness, forcing flak crews to take cover and reducing the defensive barrage that had been so effective at protecting convoys. Fighter pilots reported encounters with Wellingtons that fought back aggressively, inflicting damage and forcing the Germans to break off attacks. U-boat commanders in the Bay of Biscay reported that British aircraft were attacking with greater confidence, pressing their attacks despite fighter cover. The pattern was clear. The British were implementing the modification across their coastal command Wellington fleet, and it was having a significant impact on German operations. What had been a comfortable superiority in the air-sea battle was eroding, replaced by a more even contest where British bombers could fight back effectively. In Berlin, the reports reached the desk of General Oberst Hans Jeschonnek, Chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff. Jeschonnek was a brilliant staff officer, but also a man deeply committed to German air superiority doctrine, which held that properly employed fighters should dominate any bomber force. The idea that British bombers were successfully fighting off German fighters was both tactically troubling and ideologically offensive. Jeschonnek summoned his intelligence chief, Oberst Joseph Beppo Schmid, and demanded an explanation. Schmid, who had consistently underestimated British capabilities throughout the war, initially dismissed the reports as exaggerations by pilots seeking to excuse their failures. But as more reports accumulated, even Schmid had to acknowledge that something significant had changed. The British have modified their Wellington bombers to carry enhanced defensive armament, Schmid explained, spreading reconnaissance photographs across Jeschonnek's desk. Our analysts estimate they've added between 10 and 14 machine guns per aircraft, distributed across multiple positions to create overlapping fields of fire. How is that possible? Jeschonnek demanded. The weight alone should make the aircraft unflyable. The Wellington's geodetic structure is stronger than we initially assessed, Schmid admitted reluctantly. It can apparently support significantly more weight than conventional aircraft designs. The British have exploited this characteristic to create what is essentially a flying fortress. Jeschonnek studied the photographs, his expression darkening. What is the impact on our operations? Significant, Schmid replied. Our convoy losses have increased by approximately 30% since the modified Wellingtons entered service. Fighter losses have also increased. We've lost 11 Bf-110s in the past month, most to defensive fire from these modified bombers. And the psychological impact on our pilots is considerable. They're becoming more cautious, less willing to press attacks, which reduces their effectiveness. Yashonek was silent for a long moment, absorbing the implications. The Battle of the Atlantic was critical to Germany's war effort. British convoys brought supplies from America, food from the Empire, and resources essential to Britain's survival. German U-boats and surface raiders were strangling those supply lines, and Luftwaffe aircraft were essential to protecting German convoys and attacking British shipping. If British bombers could now operate more effectively, if they could fight their way through German defences and inflict greater damage on convoys, it would shift the balance of the entire campaign. "What are our options?" Yashonek asked. Schmid outlined several possibilities: developing new tactics, deploying heavier weapons, increasing fighter numbers, improving anti-aircraft defences on naval vessels. But each option had drawbacks: cost, time, resource allocation, competing priorities. The fundamental problem was that the British had achieved a significant tactical innovation, and the Germans were now playing catch-up. "There's another factor," Schmid added carefully. "Our intelligence suggests this modification was developed not by the Air Ministry or by official channels, but by a maintenance sergeant at an operational base. A mechanic named Torres, working with a small team, created the prototype in secret and proved its effectiveness in combat before the British High Command even knew it existed." Yashonek's expression shifted from anger to something approaching respect. "A sergeant? A mechanic?" "Yes, Herr Generaloberst. It appears to have been a grassroots innovation, born of desperation and implemented through unofficial channels. By the time British command became aware of it, the concept had already been proven in combat." Yashonek leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. German military culture emphasized top-down control, rigid adherence to doctrine, and centralized decision-making. The idea that a low-ranking NCO could develop and implement a significant tactical innovation without official approval was almost incomprehensible within the German system. Yet the British had done exactly that, and it was working. "This is what happens," Yashonek said quietly, "when we underestimate the British. We assume they're hidebound, unimaginative, incapable of innovation. We mock them as a nation of shopkeepers. And then a mechanic from Liverpool creates something that changes the tactical balance of an entire campaign." It was a rare moment of self-awareness from a senior German officer, an acknowledgement that German assumptions about British capabilities had been wrong. But acknowledgement didn't solve the problem. The modified Wellingtons were operational, they were effective, and they were inflicting increasing damage on German operations. In the months that followed, the Germans adapted as best they could. Fighter tactics evolved to emphasize coordinated attacks from multiple angles, overwhelming the Wellingtons' defenses through sheer numbers. Heavier weapons were deployed, including 30mm cannons and air-to-air rockets. Naval vessels increased their anti-aircraft armament, adding more 20mm and 37mm guns. U-boats were ordered to dive immediately when aircraft were spotted, rather than attempting to fight on the surface. But these adaptations came at a cost, in resources, in time, in the diversion of equipment and personnel from other priorities. And they were reactive, responding to a British innovation rather than driving the tactical evolution themselves. The Germans had lost the initiative in the air-sea battle, and regaining it would prove difficult. In his bunker in Stavanger, Hauptmann Dietrich continued to analyze combat reports, looking for weaknesses in the modified Wellingtons that his pilots could exploit. He found some. The aircraft were still slower than fighters, still vulnerable to coordinated attacks, still dependent on crew skill and courage. But he also found a troubling pattern. British crews flying the modified Wellingtons were more aggressive, more willing to press attacks, more confident in their ability to survive. The modification hadn't just improved their defensive capabilities, it had improved their morale, their willingness to engage, their effectiveness as a fighting force. That, Dietrich realized, was perhaps the most significant impact of Torres's innovation. It wasn't just the guns, though those were important. It was the psychological effect, the transformation of British crews from victims awaiting slaughter to warriors capable of fighting back. That shift in mindset, that restoration of confidence and aggression, was worth more than any number of additional machine guns. Late one evening, after reviewing yet another report of a modified Wellington successfully fighting off German fighters, Dietrich poured himself a schnapps and raised the glass in a silent toast. "To Sergeant Torres," he murmured, "whoever you are, you've made my job considerably more difficult, and I respect you for it." It was the highest compliment one warrior could pay another, acknowledgement that the enemy had fought well, had innovated effectively, had earned respect through skill and courage. The British mechanic from Liverpool would never know that a German fighter pilot had toasted him in a Norwegian bunker, but Dietrich felt the gesture was appropriate. The war would continue, the battle would rage on, and men would die on both sides. But the balance had shifted, and both sides knew it. The British had proven that innovation, determination, and a willingness to break the rules could change the course of a campaign. And the Germans had learned once again that underestimating the British was a mistake they made at their peril. By May 1941, Jack Torres had become something of a legend within RAF Coastal Command, though he remained uncomfortable with the attention. The modification he'd developed in secret had been officially designated the Torres configuration by the Air Ministry, and Wellingtons across Coastal Command were being retrofitted with the enhanced armament package. Torres had been promoted to warrant officer and assigned to lead a team of specialists traveling between bases, training ground crews in the modification procedures and troubleshooting problems as they arose. But success brought its own challenges, and in late May, Torres faced the greatest crisis of his career, one that threatened not just his modification, but the lives of hundreds of air crews who now depended on it. The crisis began with a routine inspection at RAF St. Ival in Cornwall, another coastal command base that had recently begun implementing the Torres configuration. Torres and his team, now expanded to include a dozen specialists, were conducting quality control checks on modified Wellingtons when Sergeant Bill Hutchins, Torres's original collaborator, discovered a crack in the fuselage frame of a Wellington that had completed 15 operational sorties since modification. The crack was small, barely visible, located at a stress point where the ventral turret mounting attached to the geodetic structure. But to Torres's experienced eye, it was deeply troubling. Stress cracks in aircraft structures could propagate rapidly, especially under the repeated loads of combat operations. If the crack grew, the entire ventral turret assembly could fail, potentially tearing away from the fuselage in flight and causing catastrophic structural damage. Torres immediately ordered a comprehensive inspection of every modified Wellington at St. Ival. By the end of the day, the team had found similar cracks in 7 of the 23 modified aircraft at the base. The pattern was consistent. All the cracks were at the same location, all in aircraft that had completed more than 10 operational sorties, all showing signs of progressive stress failure. That evening, Torres sat in the station commander's office at St. Ival, facing Group Captain Richard Pemberton, a career officer who'd been skeptical of the Torres configuration from the beginning. Pemberton listened to Torres's report with an expression that mixed concern with something approaching vindication. "So your modification is causing structural failures," Pemberton said when Torres finished. "This is exactly what the engineering experts at the Air Ministry warned about. You've added too much weight, overstressed the airframe, and now aircraft are failing in service." Torres kept his voice level, though he felt anger rising. "With respect, sir, we don't know that the modification is causing the failures. We need to conduct a thorough engineering analysis to determine the root cause." "We don't have time for analysis, warrant officer," Pemberton replied sharply. We have aircraft with structural cracks flying operational missions. The risk is unacceptable. I'm grounding all modified Wellingtons at this station until the Air Ministry conducts a full investigation. Torres felt his stomach drop. If St. Eval grounded its modified Wellingtons, other bases would follow. The entire Torres configuration program could be suspended, returning Coastal Command to the vulnerable standard Wellingtons that had been dying at such appalling rates. Months of work, dozens of successful combat missions, the lives saved by the enhanced armament, all of it could be undone by a structural problem that Torres didn't yet understand. "Sir, I request 48 hours to investigate the problem and develop a solution," Torres said. "Grounding the entire fleet based on cracks in a few aircraft may be premature." Pemberton considered this, his expression skeptical. 48 hours, warrant officer. But if you can't identify the cause and propose a fix in that time, I'm grounding the fleet and recommending the Air Ministry suspend the entire program." Torres left the office knowing he faced the most critical challenge of his career. He assembled his team in a hangar that night, and they began a systematic analysis of the cracked aircraft. Hutchins and Davies, the structural engineer, led the detailed inspections, measuring crack lengths, examining stress patterns, analyzing the load paths through the geodetic structure. By dawn, they had a theory. The cracks weren't caused by the overall weight of the modification, as Pemberton had assumed. Instead, they were caused by a specific dynamic load, the recoil forces from the ventral turret's twin guns firing simultaneously. When both guns fired, they created a sharp impulse load that was transmitted through the turret, mounting into the fuselage frame. Over repeated firing cycles, this impulse load was causing fatigue cracks at the mounting points. "It's a resonance problem," Davies explained, sketching diagrams on a chalkboard. "The firing frequency of the guns is creating a harmonic vibration in the mounting structure. Over time, that vibration is fatiguing the metal at the stress concentration points. It's not the weight, it's the dynamic loading." Torres understood immediately it was the kind of problem that wouldn't show up in static load testing, but would only manifest after repeated operational use. The solution would require either strengthening the mounting points to resist the fatigue loads, or damping the vibrations to prevent the resonance from developing. "Can we fix it?" Torres asked. Davies nodded slowly. "I think so. We need to add reinforcement plates at the mounting points and install vibration dampers, rubber isolators that will absorb the recoil impulses. It's not a complicated fix, but it will require modifying every aircraft that's already been converted." Torres made a decision. "We'll develop the fix here, test it on one aircraft, and if it works, we'll implement it across the fleet. Bill, get me every piece of aluminum plate and rubber stock on this station. Tom, start designing the reinforcement. Peter," he said, turning to Walsh, the electrician, "I need you to rig up a test fixture that can simulate the gun recoil loads so we can verify the fix works before we put it on an aircraft." The team worked through the night and the following day, driven by the knowledge that hundreds of air crews were depending on them. Davies designed reinforcement plates that would distribute the recoil loads across a larger area of the geodetic structure, reducing the stress concentration. Walsh fabricated rubber isolators from salvaged engine mounts, creating dampers that would absorb the vibration energy. Hutchins manufactured the parts in the station workshop, working with a precision that would have impressed a Swiss watchmaker. By the evening of the second day, they had a prototype fix installed on one of the cracked Wellingtons. Now came the critical test. Could the fix withstand the actual loads of operational firing? Torres arranged for the aircraft to be towed to an isolated area of the airfield, where they could conduct a ground firing test without disturbing the rest of the station. Group Captain Pemberton arrived to observe, accompanied by several engineering officers from the Air Ministry who'd been summoned to investigate the structural failures. Torres could see the skepticism on their faces. They clearly expected his improvised fix to fail, vindicating their original concerns about the modification. The test Wellington was positioned on the hardstand, its ventral turret loaded with ammunition. A volunteer gunner, leading aircraftman Wright, who'd flown the original combat mission in T-2987, climbed into the turret. Torres had instrumented the mounting points with strain gauges, crude devices that would measure the stress levels during firing. "Fire a 100-round burst," Torres ordered through the intercom. Both guns sustained fire. The ventral turret erupted in flame and noise, the twin Brownings hammering out bullets at their combined rate of 2,400 rounds per minute. The aircraft shook with the recoil, and Torres watched the strain gauges intently, comparing the readings to his calculations. After 50 seconds, the guns fell silent, their ammunition expended. Torres examined the strain gauges, then climbed into the fuselage to inspect the mounting points directly. The reinforcement plates showed no signs of cracking. The rubber isolators had compressed slightly, but remained intact. The stress readings were well within acceptable limits. Torres climbed down from the aircraft and faced Pemberton and the Air Ministry officers. "The fix works," he said simply. "The reinforcements distribute the load, and the dampers absorb the vibration. We can implement this across the fleet without grounding any aircraft. We can modify them during routine maintenance cycles." One of the Air Ministry officers, a squadron leader with an engineering background, examined the modification closely. "This is actually quite elegant," he admitted reluctantly. "You've solved a dynamic loading problem that our design teams didn't anticipate. How did you identify the root cause so quickly?" "Experience, sir," Torres replied. "I've been working on Wellingtons for 2 years. I know how they behave, how they respond to loads, where the weak points are. And I have a good team who understands structures and dynamics." Pemberton, to his credit, acknowledged the success. "Very well, warrant officer. You've earned your 48 hours. I'll authorize continued operations of modified aircraft, provided they receive your reinforcement fix within the next 2 weeks." But even as Torres felt relief at having solved the immediate crisis, he knew there would be other challenges. The Torres configuration was pushing the Wellington to its limits, and operating at those limits meant that problems would continue to emerge. Each problem would need to be solved quickly before it could undermine confidence in the modification or, worse, cause casualties. Over the following months, Torres and his team became troubleshooters for the entire Coastal Command Wellington fleet. They solved a hydraulic pressure problem that was causing nose turret failures. They redesigned the ammunition feed system for the beam guns after several jamming incidents. They developed a quick-change mounting system that allowed damaged gun turrets to be replaced in the field rather than requiring aircraft to return to depot-level maintenance facilities. Each problem solved, each improvement implemented, made the Torres configuration more reliable and more effective, but the work was exhausting, and Torres felt the strain. He was traveling constantly between bases, sleeping in whatever accommodation was available, working 18-hour days, always aware that lives depended on his team's ability to keep the modified Wellingtons flying. The breaking point came in July 1941. When Torres collapsed from exhaustion during an inspection at RAF Limavady in Northern Ireland. He woke up in the station hospital, with a doctor telling him he'd been working himself to death and needed rest. Torres tried to argue, tried to explain that there was too much work to do, too many aircraft to inspect, too many problems to solve, but his body had made the decision for him. He was physically incapable of continuing at the pace he'd been maintaining. Group Captain Winters, who'd traveled from Chivanor to check on Torres, sat beside his hospital bed and spoke with uncharacteristic gentleness. "Jack, you've done more than anyone could have asked. You've created something that's saving lives every day, but you're no good to anyone if you work yourself to death. You need to delegate, to train others to do what you do, to build a system that doesn't depend entirely on you." Torres knew Winters was right, but accepting it was difficult. He'd driven himself so hard because he felt personally responsible for every aircraft, every crew, every mission. The idea of stepping back, of trusting others to maintain the standards he'd set, felt like abandoning his responsibility. But lying in that hospital bed, too weak to stand, Torres realized he had no choice. He'd built a team of specialists who understood the Torres configuration as well as he did. Hutchins, Davies, Walsh, and a dozen others were fully capable of continuing the work. What they needed wasn't his constant presence, but his trust and his willingness to let them take ownership of the program. Over the next 2 weeks, as Torres recovered, he worked with Winters to formalize the support structure for the Torres configuration. They established a dedicated maintenance unit at Chivanor, staffed by specialists trained in the modification. They created detailed technical manuals documenting every aspect of the installation and maintenance procedures. They set up a reporting system so that problems identified at any base would be communicated to the central unit for analysis and solution. By the time Torres was released from hospital in early August, the Torres configuration had evolved from a one-man crusade into an institutionalized program supported by the full resources of Coastal Command. It was no longer dependent on Jack Torres personally, which meant it would survive and continue even if something happened to him. Torres returned to Chivanor to find that his team had successfully solved 2 more technical problems in his absence: a vibration issue with the tail turret and an electrical fault in the gun-firing circuits. They'd done it without him, proving that the system he'd built was robust enough to function independently. That evening, Torres stood on the cliffs above Chivanor, watching the sun set over the Bristol Channel. Wellington bombers were returning from patrol, their silhouettes dark against the orange sky. He could see the distinctive profiles of the modified aircraft, bristling with gun turrets, and he felt a deep satisfaction. They'd overcome the crisis, solved the structural problems, and built a sustainable system for supporting the modification. But Torres also felt something else, a bone-deep weariness, a recognition that he'd pushed himself to the edge of his limits and beyond. He'd proven what needed to be proven, built what needed to be built, and solved what needed to be solved. Now it was time to let others carry the work forward. Sergeant Hutchins joined him on the cliff, carrying 2 mugs of tea. They stood in companionable silence, watching the Wellingtons land. Each aircraft a testament to what a small team of determined men could accomplish when they refused to accept that the impossible was impossible. "We did it, Jack," Hutchins said quietly. "We actually did it," Torres nodded, sipping his tea. "We did, but it's not finished. There will be more problems, more challenges. The Germans will adapt, and will need to adapt in response. This is just one battle in a very long war." "True," Hutchins agreed. "But it's a battle we won, and that's worth something." Torres smiled, feeling the truth of that. They'd won a battle, not with bombs or bullets, but with ingenuity, determination, and a refusal to accept defeat. It was a very British victory, achieved not through overwhelming force, but through making do, muddling through, and keeping calm while carrying on. As darkness fell and the last Wellington landed safely, Torres finished his tea and headed back to the hangar. There was always more work to do, always another problem to solve, but for tonight he allowed himself to feel satisfaction in what they'd accomplished. They'd turned a crisis into an opportunity, a failure into a success, and in doing so, they'd proven once again that British ingenuity, when properly applied, could overcome any obstacle. By the autumn of 1941, the Torres configuration had become standard across Coastal Command's Wellington fleet, and its impact on the Battle of the Atlantic was undeniable. The statistics told a story that even the most skeptical Air Ministry officials couldn't ignore. Wellington losses on anti-shipping operations had dropped by 43% since the modification's introduction. Simultaneously, damage inflicted on German convoys had increased by 62%, and German fighter losses in engagements with Wellingtons had risen by over 300%. But statistics, however impressive, couldn't capture the full impact of Torres's innovation. The real transformation was psychological, a shift in the balance of confidence and fear that affected both British crews and their German adversaries. At RAF Chivanor, Flight Lieutenant Robbie McLeod, now promoted to squadron leader and commanding 221 Squadron, briefed his crews before a major operation against a German convoy supplying occupied Norway. The briefing room was crowded with air crews, their faces showing the mixture of tension and determination that characterized men about to fly into combat. But there was something else in their expressions now, something that had been absent 6 months earlier: confidence. "Gentlemen," MacLeod began, pointing to a map of the Norwegian coast, "intelligence has identified a high-value convoy departing Trondheim. 8 merchant vessels carrying supplies for the Wehrmacht's northern forces, escorted by 3 destroyers and a light cruiser. Luftwaffe fighter cover will be heavy. We're expecting at least a dozen Bf-110s and possibly some FW-190s. 6 months earlier, such a briefing would have been met with grim silence, each crew member calculating their odds of survival and finding them poor. But now, the reaction was different. The crews leaned forward, studying the map, asking tactical questions, discussing approach angles and attack sequences. They were planning how to succeed, not how to survive. "We're sending 12 aircraft," MacLeod continued. "All Torres configuration, all fully armed and ready. Our objective is to sink or damage as many merchants as possible and to suppress the escort vessels' anti-aircraft fire. We'll attack in 3 waves of 4 aircraft each, coordinating our approaches to overwhelm their defenses." The mission launched at dawn on October 15, 1941. 12 Wellingtons, each bristling with 14 guns, formed up over the Bristol Channel and set course for Norway. MacLeod led the first wave, flying in the same aircraft, T-2987, that had proven the concept 8 months earlier. The aircraft had completed 47 operational sorties since that first mission, had been damaged and repaired multiple times, and had become something of a lucky charm for the squadron. The flight across the North Sea took 3 hours, and the convoy appeared exactly where intelligence had predicted, steaming south through the inner leads, the destroyers positioned in a protective screen around the merchants, the light cruiser leading the formation. Above the convoy, German fighters circled in a defensive pattern, their pilots alert for the British bombers they knew would come. MacLeod keyed his radio. "All aircraft, this is leader. Execute attack plan Alpha. First wave, follow me in. Second and third waves, hold at altitude and engage fighters as they react." The first wave, 4 Wellingtons, including MacLeod's, dove toward the convoy from 8,000 feet. The German fighters reacted immediately, 6 Bf-110s diving to intercept, but the German pilots approached more cautiously than they would have 6 months earlier, maintaining distance, probing for weaknesses rather than pressing aggressive attacks. The lead Bf-110 made a tentative pass at MacLeod's Wellington, opening fire at 600 yards, well beyond the effective range of the Wellington's guns, but also beyond the range where the Germans' 20mm cannons were accurate. MacLeod held his course steady, and his gunners didn't waste ammunition on an out-of-range target. The German pilot's burst missed, and he broke away without closing further. "They're scared," MacLeod's tail gunner, Sergeant Thornton, observed over the intercom. "They're not pressing their attacks like they used to." Thornton was right. The German fighters were maintaining respectful distances, making cautious passes, breaking off at the first sign of return fire. They'd learned, through painful experience, that attacking a Torres configuration Wellington was costly. The aggressive, close-range attacks that had been so effective against standard Wellingtons were suicidal against aircraft that could bring 14 guns to bear. MacLeod's wave reached the convoy and began their attack runs. The destroyers and the light cruiser opened fire, their anti-aircraft guns filling the sky with flak. But as the Wellingtons dove, every gun that could bear on the German vessels opened fire. 14 guns per aircraft, 4 aircraft attacking simultaneously, 56 machine guns pouring fire into the convoy's defenses. The effect was devastating. German sailors manning exposed anti-aircraft positions were forced to take cover as bullets ricocheted off steel plating and tore through equipment. Gun crews couldn't maintain their rate of fire while being shot at, couldn't aim effectively while diving for protection. The volume of suppressive fire from the Wellingtons reduced the flak barrage by an estimated 60%, creating gaps in the defensive fire through which the bombers could attack. MacLeod's Wellington dropped its bombs on one of the merchant vessels, scoring 2 direct hits. The ship erupted in flames. It had been carrying ammunition, and the explosion was so violent that it damaged the merchant vessel sailing alongside it. The other 3 Wellingtons in the first wave scored hits on 2 more merchants and near missed a destroyer, the bombs exploding close enough to damage the warship's hull plating. As the first wave climbed away, the second wave attacked, and the pattern repeated. German fighters made cautious passes, but broke off when faced with concentrated defensive fire. The convoy's anti-aircraft guns fired desperately but were suppressed by the Wellington's machine guns. More bombs fell, more ships were hit, and the convoy's formation began to break apart as damaged vessels slowed and others maneuvered to avoid the attacks. The third wave delivered the coup de grace. By now the convoy was in chaos, its defensive coordination shattered, its fighters low on ammunition and fuel. The Wellingtons attacked almost unopposed, their bombs hitting 3 more merchant vessels and damaging the light cruiser badly enough that it had to break off and head for port. Of the 8 merchant vessels in the convoy, 5 were sinking or severely damaged. The light cruiser was out of action, 1 destroyer had been damaged. And of the 12 attacking Wellingtons, all 12 returned to base. Several had taken flak damage, and 1 had been hit by cannon fire from a Bf-110, but all were repairable. Not a single crew member had been killed. It was an unprecedented success, and the impact rippled through both Coastal Command and the Luftwaffe. For the British, it was validation of everything Torres had worked to achieve, proof that the modification not only worked, but could deliver decisive results against heavily defended targets. For the Germans, it was a disaster that called into question their entire approach to convoy defense. In his bunker in Stavanger, Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich read the after-action reports from his pilots with a growing sense of despair. His fighters had engaged 12 British bombers and had failed to shoot down a single one. They'd inflicted minor damage on a few aircraft, but had been unable to prevent the bombers from devastating the convoy. And in the process, the Germans had lost 2 Bf-110s, one shot down by defensive fire from a Wellington, the other so badly damaged that it crashed on landing. Dietrich's report to his superiors was blunt. The modified Wellington bombers have fundamentally altered the tactical balance of anti-shipping operations. Our current fighter tactics and weapons are inadequate to counter them effectively. Unless we develop new approaches, heavier weapons, different tactics, or significantly increased fighter numbers, we cannot prevent these aircraft from inflicting severe damage on our convoys. The report made its way up the chain of command, eventually reaching General Feldmarschall Hugo Sperle, commander of Luftflotte 3, which was responsible for air operations over the Atlantic and Western Europe. Sperle was a veteran of the First World War and the Spanish Civil War, a pragmatic officer who understood that wars were won by adapting to reality rather than clinging to doctrine. Sperle convened a conference of his senior officers to address the Wellington problem. The meeting, held in Paris in November 1941, brought together fighter commanders, intelligence officers, and technical experts. The consensus was sobering. The British had achieved a significant tactical advantage, and the Germans had no immediate counter. "We're facing a situation," Sperle told his officers, "where a single British NCO's innovation has forced us to completely rethink our approach to convoy defense. That should be humbling for all of us. We've been outthought and outfought by a mechanic from Liverpool." One of the fighter commanders, a colonel with a distinguished record, objected, "Surely we can develop counter-tactics, Herr General Feldmarschall. We've faced difficult opponents before and overcome them." "Of course we can adapt," Sperle replied, "but adaptation takes time, resources, and most importantly, a willingness to acknowledge that our previous assumptions were wrong." The British didn't defeat us with superior technology or overwhelming numbers. They defeated us with ingenuity and determination, qualities we've consistently underestimated in our adversaries. The conference produced several recommendations: develop heavier air-to-air weapons, increase fighter numbers assigned to convoy protection, improve coordination between fighters and naval anti-aircraft defenses, and most importantly, train pilots to respect the defensive capabilities of modified Wellingtons, rather than treating them as easy targets. But implementing these recommendations would take months, and in the meantime, British Coastal Command pressed its advantage. Throughout the winter of 1941-1942, Torres configuration Wellingtons ranged across the North Sea and the Bay of Biscay, attacking German convoys, hunting U-boats, and interdicting supply lines. The impact on German naval operations was severe. Convoy schedules were disrupted, supply deliveries were delayed, and the Kriegsmarine was forced to divert resources to protect vessels that had previously operated with relative impunity. The psychological impact on German forces was equally significant. Luftwaffe pilots became increasingly reluctant to engage modified Wellingtons, knowing that doing so was dangerous and often futile. Naval crews dreaded the appearance of British bombers, knowing that their anti-aircraft fire would be suppressed and their vessels would be vulnerable. U-boat commanders, who had previously surfaced to engage British aircraft with their deck guns, now dove immediately at the first sign of an aircraft, unwilling to face the devastating firepower of a Torres configuration Wellington. In Britain, the success of the Torres configuration became a source of national pride and a propaganda victory. The story of Jack Torres, the Liverpool mechanic who defied regulations and conventional wisdom to create a weapon that was turning the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic, was featured in newspapers and radio broadcasts. Torres himself, uncomfortable with the attention, tried to deflect credit to his team and to the air crews who flew the modified aircraft into combat. But the public had found a hero who embodied the British virtues of ingenuity, determination, and refusal to accept defeat, and they weren't about to let him fade into obscurity. For Torres, now a warrant officer first class and technical advisor to Coastal Command headquarters, the success was gratifying but also sobering. He knew that the advantage the Torres configuration provided was temporary. The Germans would adapt, would develop countermeasures, and the tactical balance would shift again. War was a constant cycle of innovation and counter-innovation, and staying ahead required continuous effort. But for now, in the winter of 1941-1942, the advantage belonged to Britain. The Torres configuration had given Coastal Command a weapon that could fight back, that could inflict real damage on German operations, and that could give British air crews a fighting chance. It wasn't a war-winning weapon, no single innovation could be that, but it was a battle-winning one. And in the desperate struggle of the Battle of the Atlantic, winning battles mattered. As 1941 turned to 1942, Jack Torres stood once again on the cliffs above Chivanor, watching Wellingtons return from patrol. The aircraft were battered, their fabric skin torn, their gun barrels still warm from combat. But they were returning, their crews alive, their missions accomplished. That, Torres thought, was what mattered. Not the medals or the recognition or the newspaper stories, but the simple fact that men who flew out in the morning came home in the evening. He'd set out to solve a problem, to give British air crews a fighting chance against an enemy that had been killing them with impunity. He'd succeeded, not through genius or brilliance, but through determination, hard work, and a willingness to break the rules when the rules were getting men killed. It was a very British solution to a very British problem, and Torres was proud of it. But the war wasn't over, and there was still work to do. Torres turned away from the cliffs and headed back to the hangar, where his team was already preparing for the next day's operations. There would be more challenges, more problems to solve, more innovations needed. The Germans would adapt, and the British would need to adapt in response. It was the nature of war, the endless cycle of move and countermove. But for now, the British had the advantage, and Jack Torres intended to make sure they kept it for as long as possible. The men flying those Wellingtons deserved nothing less. The spring of 1945 brought victory in Europe, and with it, the end of the desperate struggle that had consumed Jack Torres's life for 4 years. On VE Day, Torres stood in Trafalgar Square among thousands of Londoners celebrating the defeat of Nazi Germany. Watching Churchill address the crowds from the balcony of the Ministry of Health, the Prime Minister's words, "This is your victory," resonated with Torres in a way that transcended the public celebration. It was their victory, the victory of ordinary British men and women who'd refused to surrender, who'd improvised and adapted and fought with whatever weapons they could create. Torres was 40 years old now, his hair graying, his face lined with the exhaustion of years spent working 18-hour days. He'd been awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his contributions to the war effort, an unprecedented honor for a non-commissioned officer, and had been offered a commission and a permanent position in the peacetime RAF. He'd declined both, explaining that he was a mechanic, not an officer, and that his place was in the workshops, not in the headquarters. But the war had changed Torres, as it had changed Britain. The man who'd secretly modified a Wellington in a Devon hangar in 1941 was now a recognized expert in aircraft armament systems, consulted by designers and engineers, his opinions sought by senior officers. The Torres configuration had evolved far beyond its original form, incorporating lessons learned from 4 years of combat operations, and had influenced the design of post-war aircraft. The final statistics of the Torres configuration's impact were compiled by Coastal Command historians in the months after VE Day, and they told a remarkable story. Between March 1941 and May 1945, over 800 Wellington bombers had been modified to the Torres configuration standard. These aircraft had flown more than 47,000 operational sorties, had sunk or damaged over 400 German vessels, and had shot down 127 enemy aircraft. Most significantly, the loss rate for Torres configuration Wellingtons was 41% lower than for standard Wellingtons operating in the same role, a difference that translated to approximately 2,400 lives saved. But numbers, however impressive, couldn't capture the full legacy of what Torres had created. The real impact was in the transformation of British tactical doctrine, the recognition that innovation could come from anywhere in the military hierarchy, and the validation of the principle that sometimes the best solutions came from those closest to the problem, rather than from distant headquarters. In the summer of 1945, Torres returned to Chivanor for a ceremony honoring 221 Squadron, which had flown more Torres configuration sorties than any other unit. Squadron leader Robbie McLeod, now a wing commander with a distinguished flying cross and bar, greeted Torres with the bear hug that had become their traditional greeting. "Jack, you magnificent bastard," McLeod said, grinning. "They're finally giving us proper recognition. About bloody time." The ceremony was attended by Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, Commander-in-Chief of RAF Bomber Command, who'd come to pay tribute to Coastal Command's contribution to the war effort. Harris, known for his blunt speaking and his focus on strategic bombing, surprised everyone by singling out Torres in his speech. "The story of the Torres configuration," Harris said, "exemplifies what made Britain victorious in this war. We didn't win because we had better technology than the Germans. Often we didn't. We didn't win because we had more resources. For much of the war, we had fewer. We won because we had men like Warrant Officer Torres, who saw a problem, refused to accept that it was unsolvable, and created a solution through ingenuity, determination, and sheer bloody-mindedness. That spirit, the spirit of making do, of muddling through, of keeping calm and carrying on, is what defeated Nazi Germany." After the ceremony, Torres walked through the maintenance hangars at Chivanor, now quiet with the war's end. Many of the Wellingtons were being scrapped, their geodetic structures cut apart, their fabric skins stripped away. It was a melancholy sight. These aircraft had carried men into combat, had brought them home, had been the instruments of victory. Now they were being reduced to scrap metal, their service ended. Torres found T-2987, the original prototype, parked in a corner of a hangar. The aircraft had survived the war, had completed 127 operational sorties, a record for Coastal Command Wellingtons, and had been recommended for preservation. Torres ran his hand along the fabric skin, feeling the patches where battle damage had been repaired, remembering the night in February 1941 when he and his team had first installed the modifications that would change the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. "She's going to the RAF museum," a voice said behind him. Torres turned to find Group Captain Harold Winters, now retired, but still maintaining connections with Chivanor. "They're preserving her as an example of British innovation during the war. Your innovation, Jack." Torres shook his head. "It wasn't just me, sir. It was Bill Hutchins, Tom Davies, Peter Walsh, and dozens of others. It was MacLeod and his crew who proved the concept worked. It was every ground crew member who installed the modifications and every air crew who flew them into combat. I just had the initial idea." "Don't be modest, Jack," Winters replied. "Yes, others contributed, but you were the driving force. You saw what needed to be done and you did it. Regulations be damned. That took courage, not the courage to face enemy fire, but the courage to challenge authority, to risk your career, to do what you knew was right, even when everyone told you it was impossible." They stood in silence for a moment, looking at T-2987. Then Winters said, "What will you do now, Jack? The RAF wants to keep you on, and there are civilian aircraft companies that would hire you in a heartbeat. You've got options." Torres had been thinking about this question for months. The war had consumed his life, had given him purpose and direction. Now, with peace, he needed to find a new purpose. "I'm going back to Liverpool," he said finally. "Going to work in the aircraft factories there, help build the civilian aircraft that will rebuild Britain. We've spent 6 years destroying things. Now it's time to build." Winters nodded approvingly. "That's a good answer, Jack. Britain will need builders in the years ahead." Torres returned to Liverpool in August 1945, to a city scarred by German bombing, but already beginning to rebuild. He took a position at the Roots Securities factory in Speke, which was transitioning from military aircraft production to civilian work. His reputation had preceded him, and he was given significant responsibility in designing maintenance systems for the new generation of civilian aircraft. But Torres never forgot the lessons of the war years. He insisted that maintenance crews be consulted in aircraft design, that the men who would actually work on the aircraft have input into how they were built. He championed the idea that innovation could come from anywhere, that a mechanic's insight might be as valuable as an engineer's calculation. And he mentored young workers, teaching them not just technical skills, but the importance of thinking creatively, of questioning assumptions, of refusing to accept that problems were unsolvable. In the decades after the war, the Torres configuration became a case study in military innovation, taught at staff colleges and analyzed by historians. The story of how a Liverpool mechanic had transformed a vulnerable bomber into a formidable weapon became part of the mythology of British ingenuity during the Second World War, alongside the Spitfire, the radar chain, and the codebreakers of Bletchley Park. But for those who'd actually flown the Torres configuration Wellingtons, the legacy was more personal. At reunions of 221 Squadron and other coastal command units, veterans would seek out Torres, shake his hand, and thank him for giving them a fighting chance. Many credited him with saving their lives, with making the difference between coming home and becoming another name on a memorial. Torres always deflected the thanks, insisting he'd just done his job. But privately, he treasured these encounters, these reminders that his work had mattered, that the midnight hours in a Devon hangar had translated into men coming home to their families. In 1965, On the 20th anniversary of VE Day, Torres was invited to give a lecture at the RAF Staff College on the development of the Torres configuration. He was 60 years old now, retired from the aircraft industry, living quietly in Liverpool with his wife. He almost declined the invitation. Public speaking had never been his strength, but his wife convinced him to accept. The lecture hall was packed with RAF officers, many of them too young to have served in the war, eager to hear from the man who'd become a legend. Torres stood at the podium, looking out at the audience, and for a moment he was transported back to that February morning in 1941, watching Flight Lieutenant Ashford's damaged Wellington land at Chivanor, making the decision that would change his life. "I'm often asked," Torres began, "what inspired me to create the Torres configuration? The answer is simple. I was tired of watching men die. I was tired of scraping blood from cockpit floors, of packing dead men's belongings to send home, of listening to survivors describe how helpless they felt facing German fighters with inadequate weapons. I didn't set out to create a legend or to win medals. I set out to solve a problem that was killing British air crews." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The lesson I hope you take from this story isn't that I was particularly brilliant or heroic. The lesson is that sometimes the best solutions come from those closest to the problem, from those who see the reality of a situation rather than the theory. I was a mechanic. I worked on those aircraft every day. I saw what was failing, what was needed, what was possible. And when I proposed a solution, the official channels dismissed it as impossible. So I built it anyway," Torres continued. "I violated regulations, misappropriated resources, and risked court-martial. I did it because I believed the solution would work, and because I believed that saving lives was more important than following rules that were getting men killed. That's not a lesson I can officially recommend to serving officers," he added with a slight smile, "but it's the truth of what happened. The Torres configuration worked not because of any genius on my part, but because I understood the Wellingtons' geodetic structure, because I had a team of skilled specialists who could execute the modifications, and because we had a pilot, Wing Commander MacLeod, who was brave enough to test an unauthorized modification in combat. It worked because we were all willing to take risks, to challenge assumptions, to do what needed to be done, rather than what was officially approved." Torres concluded his lecture with words that would be quoted in military journals for years afterward. "Innovation in warfare doesn't come from following doctrine. It comes from understanding the reality of combat, identifying what's failing, and having the courage to try something different. Sometimes that means breaking rules, sometimes it means risking your career. But if the alternative is watching men die because you were too timid to challenge authority, then breaking rules is the right choice. That's what I learned in the war, and it's what I hope you'll remember." The audience gave him a standing ovation, and afterward, dozens of officers lined up to shake his hand and ask questions. Torres answered them all patiently, emphasizing again and again that the Torres configuration's success was a team effort, that he'd been fortunate to work with skilled people who shared his determination. Jack Torres died in 1983, at the age of 78, in Liverpool. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including surviving members of his modification team, veterans of Coastal Command, and senior RAF officers. Wing Commander Robbie MacLeod, himself in his 80s, delivered the eulogy. "Jack Torres," MacLeod said, "was the finest example of British ingenuity and determination I ever knew. He saw a problem that was killing his countrymen, and he solved it through skill, courage, and sheer bloody-mindedness. He didn't wait for permission, didn't accept that it was impossible, didn't let regulations stand in the way of doing what was right. He saved thousands of lives, changed the course of the Battle of the Atlantic, and proved that sometimes the best innovations come from those willing to challenge authority and break the rules. But more than that," MacLeod continued, "Jack embodied the spirit that made Britain victorious in the darkest days of the war. The spirit of making do with what you have, of refusing to surrender, of keeping calm and carrying on no matter how desperate the situation. He was a Liverpool mechanic who changed the course of history, and we are all in his debt. Torres was buried in Liverpool, not far from the docks where his father had worked before drowning in the First World War. His headstone bore a simple inscription: Jack Torres, 1905-1983, Warrant Officer, Royal Air Force. He gave them a fighting chance. In the decades since his death, the Torres configuration has been recognized as one of the most significant tactical innovations of the Second World War. Military historians credit it with saving thousands of lives, with shifting the balance of the Battle of the Atlantic, and with demonstrating the importance of grassroots innovation in warfare. The original prototype, T-2987, remains on display at the RAF Museum in Hendon, a testament to what one determined man and his team could accomplish. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Torres's legacy is found not in museums or history books, but in the continued emphasis within the RAF on encouraging innovation from all ranks, on listening to those closest to operational problems, and on being willing to challenge doctrine when reality demands it. The Torres configuration proved that sometimes the best ideas come from unexpected sources, and that courage isn't just about facing enemy fire. It's also about having the conviction to do what's right, even when authority says it's impossible. Jack Torres never sought glory or recognition. He was a mechanic who saw men dying and found a way to save them. In doing so, he embodied the best of British character: practical, determined, innovative, and utterly unwilling to accept defeat. His legacy lives on in every military innovation that challenges conventional wisdom, in every junior officer or NCO who has the courage to propose a better way, and in the principle that in warfare, as in life, the impossible is often just the untried. The Torres configuration was more than a modification to an aircraft. It was proof that ingenuity, determination, and a willingness to break the rules when necessary could change the course of history. And that, perhaps, is the most British legacy of all. If you've enjoyed this remarkable tale of British ingenuity, determination, and the indomitable spirit that helped turn the tide of the Second World War, please do subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. What other untold stories of innovation and courage from the war years would you like us to explore? Your suggestions help us bring these extraordinary accounts of British resilience to light. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the greatest victories come not from following the rules, but from having the courage to rewrite them when lives depend on it.